As a landscape photographer, you'll often come across scenes that make it difficult to capture enough information in both the highlights and the shadows of an image. Now the goal here is to use proper exposure, and this is the exposure that results in as much information as possible in your raw image. So that's what we're going to talk about in this section. So what is proper or optimal exposure in landscape photography? Well, for digital photography, optimal exposure is the one that captures as much information as possible. And because light is information, your optimal digital exposure will be as bright as it can be. However, this presents an obvious problem. If your photograph is too bright, then you might end up overexposing the highlights to the point that there's no recoverable information in them. To balance these two factors, you want the brightest possible exposure that doesn't blow out any of your important highlights. And this is known as exposing to the right. Now, some people consider exposing to the right just to be another camera technique, but that's not what we're going to refer to it as in this video. Exposing to the right is the optimal digital exposure. It's what you should be doing for every single one of your photos. When you're exposing to the right, the only two settings that you'll want to change on your camera are shutter speed and aperture, not ISO. And this is because shutter speed and aperture are the only two settings on your camera that influence the amount of light that reaches your camera's sensor. ISO, on the other hand, you'll always want to leave at its base value whenever possible, something like ISO 100. Now, when you're out in the field and you're trying to see whether you've achieved proper digital exposure, what you need to do is look at your camera's histogram or blinkies while you're taking pictures. After I've taken a photo, if I want to see whether I've achieved proper exposure, one of my first steps might just be to look at the blinkies. And as you can see, in this case, the blinkies are telling me that almost my entire sky is overexposed, and potentially irrecoverable in post-production. And that's one of the main benefits of the blinkies. They show you your whole photo at once, and you can see specifically which portions might be overexposed. The other way to judge exposure is to look at your camera's histogram. And as you can see here, I have 3 sample histograms. One that's too dark, one that matches my camera's suggested metered exposure, and one that's too bright. But actually, none of these histograms represents the optimal digital exposure. Instead, this histogram is optimal. As you can see, the histogram bunches up to the right-hand side of the frame, which is actually where the term exposing to the right comes from. And in this case, it's optimal because I'm not blowing out any of my highlights, but I'm capturing as much light as possible. So let's take a look at a couple of examples to show exactly what I mean. Now, this photograph represents a typical exposure that your camera's meter might suggest. However, it isn't optimal. Instead, something like this is ideal. Now, this photograph might look somewhat overexposed, but it's actually the optimal digital exposure, because none of my brightest highlights are overexposed, including in the snow and the brightest clouds. So what I can just do is take this photograph into post-processing and darken it to match exactly the image that I want. So why would I want to do something like this? The prior image looked perfectly fine, and it seems like I'm just increasing the amount of work for myself in post-production. But there are benefits to exposing to the right. Take a look at this photograph, for example. Now, I took this image at the camera's metered exposure before I exposed a second image to the right. Now, the second image was obviously brighter than this first one, so I darkened it in post-production. And as you can see, the two are very similar brightnesses. But there are other differences between these images that you can't necessarily see at this magnification. So let's zoom in at some tighter crops. As you can see, I have 2 crops from the same 2 images, both at 100% view. And between them, there are visible image quality differences. Specifically, the photograph that was exposed to the right has less noise than the photograph that wasn't. And that's the main benefit of exposing to the right. You end up taking full advantage of your camera's sensor. Now, this difference may be huge for you, or it may not be, but we're teaching you proper exposure, and proper exposure is exposing to the right. As landscape photographers, we're always looking for the best possible image quality, and this is the optimal way. One of the most important things to keep in mind when you're exposing to the right is that your photograph might be darker or even significantly darker than what the camera's meter suggests. And this is because exposing to the right has nothing to do with the actual brightness of your image. It has everything to do with preserving your highlights. Take a look at this photograph, for example. As you can see, this image looks very dark, especially in the shadows. But this is actually a perfectly exposed to the right image, because I haven't lost any detail in my highlights. Specifically, look at the histogram. Here, the brightest part of the image is right up against the right-hand edge of the frame, but it's not touching it, which means that none of my highlights are overexposed. So even though this has a very saddle-shaped histogram, where much of the image is very dark, this is actually a perfect ETTR exposure. A result like this is fairly common in landscape photography, particularly when you're taking pictures near sunrise or sunset and the sky is significantly brighter than the foreground. But there are still ways to add some brightness to these shadows. Specifically, you might use HDR or blending techniques to combine multiple exposures together in post-production. Or my preferred technique, just to get it right in the camera, is to use a filter, in this case a graduated neutral density filter, to darken the sky so that I can boost my entire exposure and end up with a well-exposed foreground and a well-exposed sky. Initially, exposing to the right might seem somewhat complex, but your end goal is just to get to a point where it's totally second nature. And in fact, you only have to remember two things in the field. First, get the brightest possible exposure. And second, make sure that none of your important highlights are blown out to being completely white. If you can remember just those two things, then you are capturing the optimal exposure. Finally, be aware that your histogram and blinkies don't actually represent the raw data that you're capturing. Instead, they only reflect your in-camera JPEG preview, which doesn't contain as much information. And this means that you might actually be able to expose even farther to the right than your histogram or blinkies would suggest. However, I only recommend this if you're already experienced with exposing to the right and you're familiar with the capabilities of your camera.